My guest on Future Cities Africa today is Geci Karuri-Sebina. She worked in large governance and research institutions, mainly providing research, technical assistance, advisory and evaluation services to public sector institutions in areas related to urban development policy, planning and governance. Geci, welcome. Can you take us on a tour of your background and your current work?
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thanks for having me. So my background is quite mixed up. It's a bit of a journey. I'm not always sure it makes sense to anybody else. I started off sort of in tech. So I was a computer science major. Enjoyed it, but missed contact with people and missed, I think, some space for application. I enjoy the tech itself and I enjoy technical work, but I really wanted it to connect better to people. So I took a second degree at that stage in sociology. And that became a path, sort of urban sociology, got into architecture, did my master's in architecture, went into urban planning because I wanted to scale up a bit and that was interesting. And that sort of became my path. So I was studying in Los Angeles at the time, met my now partner and moved to South Africa with him, basically followed him here. I call myself a romantic refugee. I was born in Kenya. And so we came here. I worked at the CSIR for many years, then the Human Sciences Research Council, went into government. I'd been evaluating a lot of government programs actually already, mainly in urban development issues. Did my PhD around that time, went into National Treasury for a few years, looking at townships development and the neighborhood development program there. Into Cities Network, where I was executive manager for a few years. And now I'm doing this and that. So a lot of my work is still around urban issues, but very much with a futures lens. I'm very interested in issues of innovation and change, political change.
You're involved in urban futures and the future of cities and governance. You mentioned South African Cities Network, and you're also involved in the Singularity University. Can you expand a bit more on the specific work that you're doing at the South African Cities Network and at the Singularity University?
Okay, so Cities Network, I think, as you and your audiences may know, is this network of metros in South Africa, and the Secretariat's function is really around trying to bring knowledge-based research thinking, scholarship into the practical work and the political work of cities, the large cities in South Africa. So, when I was obviously managing there, it was much more hands-on across a range of urban development issues and trying to oversee that. As an associate, I have a much more limited, thankfully, role, and I just get to be involved in a few of the interesting projects that I can advise and assist on. So currently, I'm giving some advice on the production of the current State of Cities report. So that's a report SACN puts out every 5 years and tries to be some sort of a bird's eye view of what's happening in cities and what the urban agenda needs to be from a practitioner perspective and an administration perspective. So that normally comes out around the time of a local government election, and it's trying to educate and illustrate to people in an empirically, in a sort of a grounded way, what's been going on. So giving some advice on that, having worked on the 2016 one, so the next one will be 2021. That's quite exciting. Very fun is involved in something around the open IUDF, so the Integrated Urban Development Framework, and I'm sure we can share a link to that, is the National Urban Policy Framework, basically. But with the Open IUDF, what we're trying to do is to say, okay, in addition to a governmental process that tries to actualize the vision of the IUDF, we probably need the whole of society approach that's spoken of in the document to be much more real. So what is Dan doing about the urban agenda? What's my neighbor here doing about the urban agenda? Do people even know about it? And so with the Open IUDF, one of the things we've done is we put out an open call asking anybody from civil society, from communities, individuals, organizations, to propose ideas of things they would like to do that they feel contribute to the urban vision of the country. So that was quite exciting, and we've just gone through the first adjudication for the first set of grantees in this call. And Dan, it's really exciting. It's really fun to do this sort of thing because it's everything from people suggesting bucket farming as something that anybody could do to produce food at a household level, to people suggesting intercultural dialogues, in their communities, to people suggesting awareness campaigns, young people saying that, look, I'm a young scientist and I've studied and understood this issue, but I know my community doesn't understand it. And I'd like just a little bit of support to translate this material, not in terms of language, but to translate into the kind of spaces I come from. And so being able to support people to do something like that, to connect their formal life, if you want, to their lived life. So really exciting to go through those, and we're really looking forward to granting the first set. So those are the kinds of things I'm doing with SACN, and I'm really enjoying that. Singularity University was an interesting one because so Singularity University is based out of Silicon Valley, as some people may know, and we now have a Singularity U South Africa, and they're the ones who initially approached me about joining the global faculty. And it was really around the topics of future cities and governance. And my initial response had actually been no. The reason being, it's a very different space and a very different audience. I'm very public oriented, as you can hear. I've always believed in change through large public organizations, whether it's government or non-governmental, but certainly not corporate. I've never done corporate work deliberately. So, but I think age and experience are showing me that it really takes all kinds, and we really have to find each other. We really have to find ways to find each other. So although SU tends to hit a more corporatish crowd, it is kind of a social enterprise leaning crowd, and I've found that actually there is synergy, and we are probably wanting to do the same, well, get to the same places, maybe not in the same ways. And so I really appreciated the openness that the SU South Africa crowd, so Mick and Shane, who approached me, their openness to my views and even my critiques. And they've never tried to get me to change my message. So I really appreciated that, because sometimes you get onto some of these platforms, and people try to get you to water things down or be a little bit more presentable for that audience. And I really haven't had a sense of that. And in a way, it has opened me up to different audiences, both locally in terms of that sort of corporate audience, but also internationally. I've spoken in San Francisco, in Greece, in Costa Rica. I was supposed to be speaking in Kenya a few months ago, but it wasn't for COVID. And I think, the days I'm still a bit uncomfortable about the platform and the sort of its private sector orientation, and they always do things really big and flashy. I'm not used to that. I'm used to a much more humble kind of stage. But I appreciate it for what it is, and it's an interesting other space to speak into and to share some of my ideas into.
When it comes to implementing and actioning these reports, we do require a lot of stakeholder collaboration. What, in your view, is some of the challenges to effective stakeholder collaboration, and how would you try and fix that?
It's a tough one, because we know that in South Africa we struggle with so many things. We struggle with this urgency, first of all, to see things done and fixed, because it's been too long. For many people, it's been too long, and the urgency is real. And so we struggle with people wanting to see things move faster. We struggle with our trust deficit, where we don't always, so we talk about public and private needing to work together, but we know that we don't do that very well. And so I think we have to keep at some of those things. I've feared for some time now that there's a level of fatigue. I think that many officials have begun to suffer with this idea of needing to engage with anybody at all. Because at some stage you're just hurtful. You're like, let's just get on with what we know needs to be done. And on some level, I think that's correct, where the agenda is clear. But in the urban space, there's so much in the agenda that's not clear, and that's evolving, and that needs constant engagement, and that needs partnership if we're to afford and figure out some of these things. So I think we need to invest a lot more, first of all, skill in facilitating the stakeholder engagements. I think we need a lot more openness on both sides. Well, it's not both sides, on all sides, because I think it's also communities, and it's also the science community. It's on so many levels. We need to invest, I think, the skill and the time to understand that this is going to take time. It's for the long haul. It's not, I think I was saying yesterday in a session that, sometimes we behave as though the time for participation and consultation was done, and now we should just be getting on with it. But that's not how things work. And we could look to the rest of the world to recognize that. So I think if we want to get beyond a situation where everything is, it's conflict or complete agreement and there's nothing in between, if we want to get beyond that, then I think we need to figure out how to do this better. And that links to how we are governed and how we govern ourselves across sectors, not only in government. So I think also leaving that to being the problem of government to figure out probably isn't a wise choice.
Let's talk about smart cities. What is your definition of a smart city?
So this is often where my talk gets, for some people, a bit controversial. So when many people ask, and I'm often asked to speak about smart cities, they often have this sort of, the high shiny buildings, the, Internet of Things, sensors everywhere, robots doing the work, all sorts, really a tech vision overlaid on a glossy city is often what people mean. Maybe some ideas about what the green city might look like. So again, all sorts of tech around water, energy, smart buildings. And I know, and I'm very interested in all of that, but it's not what I speak about at all. And it's not what really interests me in terms of the smart city from an African perspective. And the reason is this: I think those are constituent elements, and we should use all of the tech we can use and we need to use. So tech comes into it. I would agree, and in fact, we've just completed some work with SAC, and there's a discussion paper we've put together about an interpretation of smart cities that sort of says that, look, doing things intelligently, and in the modern age, that means using data better and using tech to the extent that we can, is absolutely a constituent part of it. But for me, what is smart is what's the vision, contextualized vision, of the city that you're in, and how are you going about that? And those are questions about imagination, those are questions about governance, those are questions about the kinds of systems and processes you put in place. Those aren't first questions about tech. Those are maybe in number 4, number 5, we get to the tech, because tech can also enable systems, tech can also enable governance, tech can also enable all of that. But you'll hear that I'm consistently using the word enable. So even though I come from a tech background, I'm involved in a civic tech network, so tech is very much a language I appreciate and speak. I do think that the idea of the smart city is foolhardy if it is led only by an idea that tech is going to change everything and save everything. I think tech could destroy us. I don't think it can save us. So my idea for the smart city is definitely, first of all, led by a vision, a contextualized vision for who the city is and how the city is growing, what the city is trying to be. Excuse my hadi-das as I speak. But it's really led by that, and I think it's nurtured by ideas of agility, because that's what we need. We're in a context of change. I've often said that, we're in this time of pandemic, and to me, that's not the big shift. That's one of many small shifts we're experiencing all the time. The smart city in an unequal place like Johannesburg has to be about inequality. So what's a smart unequal city, and what is it trying to be? A smart city has to be about our institutions. We were just talking now about stakeholders. If we've got a public sector and private sector at a local level that can't speak to each other, that doesn't sound very smart. What are we doing about that? If we've got departments that don't speak to each other, we've got a transport department doing one thing, and an energy entity doing something else, and a planning department arguing for something else. That doesn't sound very smart. Now, all of these things could be facilitated through tech, but I think just slapping tech onto it and deciding that that's the savior, that's the smart city, I don't think makes sense. And I often refer to examples around the world of where I see the idea of smart being taken up in much more interesting ways. So I like Barcelona. I like Barcelona because for them, smart city was not always just the highest tech. It was also some very low-tech solutions that addressed what were real issues there. And I like Barcelona, the city, as well, because I see it as, and if you've been there, it's very human scale. It's not sort of the big, overwhelming city like many cities aspire to be. And I think they've, in a way, gone the same approach with the tech, where the tech, in my view, is a little bit more human scale. It's a bit more responsive to what are the actual issues we're having, not just trying to say that, well, because elsewhere smart cities have big shiny buildings or have some fancy rail system, that's what we need to have to be smart. So it's not competing on a tech checklist. It's not seeing whether we've done the most, the list AI, blockchain, IoT, you can have that checklist. That's not what it's about, not for me.
Let's imagine that you are president and that you have a magic wand. How would you get us to inclusive cities?
Wow. Okay, so that's a big question. I think the one thing well, several things probably. We need to have people on the job And on the job doesn't mean just government officials. It's everybody on the job. Everybody who's doing stuff actively, and particularly those with power. And so I think power becomes very important. It's got to be that inclusion is on their radar, on their agenda, and that they have the confidence to do that. They have the creativity to figure out what to do about it, and that they're empowered. So this idea that the ecosystem, that the environment around them also allows them to act this out, to play out some of their ideas and perhaps to even experiment with some ideas. For me, my wand would probably be very much about people. Inclusion is not an issue for other species. It's a very human thing. And so I tend to think that our only way to engage with it would begin with us. But often I feel as though people either aren't thinking about it or are overwhelmed and therefore choose to do, they're aware, but they don't think they can actually do anything. Or they are aware, they think they can do something about it, but they don't have the creativity, the skill, the innovative ability, and they're not able to tap into those who do. So they stand in the way sometimes of those who do. And then this idea that the environment has to then nurture them. I think my magic wand would try to tap onto, if I had, I guess those are 3 or 4 wishes, to get that mix right, because I don't think anybody will solve this but us. And so if we have exclusion that's still happening in our cities, that's us, that's not anybody else.
Then with your magic wand, if there's one piece of legislation that you could change that's inhibiting kind of the work that you're doing or the vision that you have for what a future city should look like, what would be that one legislation? And you have the magic wand, so you can change 2 as well.
I don't know if it's a piece of legislation, but I think there's something about our, people, and this will sound a bit cliche, but there's something about our political administrative interface. And I know that's like a much used term. My colleague Danga at SACN talks quite a lot about this, and rightly so. But I do think there's something in there, because when I engage with officials, and SACN has been engaging a lot with officials in the government space, you begin to realize that there are a lot of people who probably, so I talked about skill, right? There are people who have the skill, maybe, and the understanding often, to actually do something different. But there's something that happens in the system that doesn't allow that to be actualized. Either people are not empowered enough, or people feel that they're blocked by the politics of the day, or they feel that the mandates are too tight. There's something about that space. There's something about what people think is their job and what they're responsible for that doesn't play quite right. So I would definitely do something around how government works and the extent to which officials feel that they have the space and the responsibility to be doing more. But I'd certainly use my second wish as well, and that would be on the private sector. I think, we know that we're in a country that's extremely market-driven, and where the economy is held in particular places. Maybe this comes back to the trust issue, to, people talked about, whether, do we have patriotic capital and this sort of thing. I don't use the language of patriotism much. I'm not much of a nationalist. But I do think this idea that I would try to tap my wand to get people to understand that our futures are interlinked, and there are things we need to do that are actually just sensible because they're good for everybody. And that if we had a bit of faith in that, and if we were willing to invest in that there's something special we could do here. I've always believed, and maybe because I'm a newbie, I've been in South Africa for 20 years now, but I've always believed that this country could do special things. I don't think we do very many special things, and that disappoints me, and I think disappoints many people hugely. But perhaps those are 2 levers, I think. If we had officials that really could get on with doing some amazing things, and then if we had an economy in terms of those who hold it, and I talked about power earlier, that really believed that this was a place worth trusting and investing themselves in for the many, not for the few, I think we could do amazing things. I think we could have smart cities.
Do you even like the term smart cities? I know a lot of people like to prefer to intelligent cities.
Yeah, yesterday in our session, we had Joe Ravitz from Manchester who's talked about deeper cities. And the term he uses is wise. So he talks about going from smart, which is in his view about innovation, to wise, which is about doing something different. Do I like the term smart cities? Yes and no. I like it to the extent that it focuses us into a conversation. So it's raised a lot of interest. I don't think, I mean, I've been an urbanist for going on 25 years now. And then in South Africa for 20 years, working on urban issues almost. And in the past few years, with words like smart cities coming up, you've never seen this amount of interest in understanding cities and what is smart cities and how do we build smart cities. So to the extent it's energizing people and making people feel invested in a conversation about the places we live, I think that's great. I don't think urban planning ever got that kind of attention. So this clearly focuses people. I agree with you. I think it's got a shelf life to it. I think, yeah, so I enjoy it as a rallying call, a mobilizer. I enjoy it as a provocation because it provokes me to argue against it so often. I think future cities is nice and open and in a way factual. I mean, we're moving into some kinds of futures, and I think that'll always be, the conversation about next.
I'm going to give you a time machine. I'm being very generous. What do you see cities will look like in 20 years from now? What are the technologies? What are the kind of the visual? Do you think urbanization will carry on at the pace it's been carrying on? Do you think people will spread out into the suburbs? And also kind of what are your hopes? Like, what do you want to see 20 years from now?
Yeah, so, I mean, and I guess we're talking about South African cities, right? So I think there are a couple of scenarios here. So now I have to lean on my futures methods to say that I don't know if it's a single vision that I can share. I think there's a chance that it's more or less the trajectory we're on today and just more of that. And if you think about 20 years ago, that's kind of where we are now. It's kind of been a bit more of the same, just more intensely in some places. And I think there is a possibility, particularly given where the economy is and the world is right now, that it's more of that, maybe a little bit more social distanced, maybe a little bit higher, but more or less the same. But I think there are other possibilities. I do think that there's some recognition, obviously, to the extent smart refers to tech, there are some of these technologies that make things possible that weren't before. And there's a possibility of us perhaps having built forms that are more, if you want, accessible to everybody, they can scale a lot better, that can be afforded and maintained a lot better. And so we were, in a way, pre-COVID already beginning to see that much more housing, some densification beginning to happen. So I think there's the possibility that we do what we've been doing, but a little bit better. So that's kind of marginal improvements on business as usual. But beyond that, we kind of in the smart city world have these two visions, right? Dubai or Wakanda. So and there I think I have three messages that I kind of haven't moved on, and in fact it's three messages that the SU faculty role got me to crystallize in my own mind, because I'm asked this question so many times. I had to keep thinking, what do I think will change the city into something much more transformed, something much more interesting, because that's what I'd like to see. I'd like to see, and maybe now I'm mixing my time machine with my magic wand here. I'd like to see cities. I'd love to go to different places and see different cities. I'd love to go to Joburg and see a city that I could never have imagined if I was sitting in America. I would love to go to Umtata and find, wow, this is really interesting. I mean, this is something that wouldn't be in Gauteng because it's not Gauteng, it's Umtata, it's in Eastern Cape. I'd love to see that kind of specificity, that kind of flavor, that kind of diversity in places. And for me, there are three things. So these are the three messages that I kind of haven't really moved beyond, and I'm yet to convince myself that there's something else worth saying. The one is the imaginaries. I think we've got to have and find new images, new ideas, new narratives of what cities can be that allow that kind of variety. And in that regard, there's some work I'm doing with my collaborator, Tiresh Govender, on that, this idea of what, how do we play with the metaphor of the city? How do we play with different representations? We've all seen the renderings. We've all seen the kind of watercolor, either watercolor paintings or the CAD renderings of the future city, Lagos, Joburg, Kigali, whatever. We've got to get beyond that. And so there's something about our imagination that needs to be expanded to where we can imagine an Umtata that looks quite unique and fabulous and a Joburg Badasti. So the new imaginaries, I link that then to the idea of new processes. We're going to have to work differently to get to that kind of a vision. And for me, the big catch piece there is participation, and you raised it as well. How do you work with many more people in much more inclusive ways? And there's some of these ideas around human-centered design, different kinds of forms of, much more radically participative approaches. I think we really need to explore that. And then the last one is new institutions. How do we actually allow different things to happen? And that's everything from whether it's the planning regulations to what I was talking about earlier, how officials understand their mandate, what the politics of the day allow, what capital is willing to invest in, what consumers like you and me believe is acceptable as a home or a house. If we all want to buy the same thing, then the market produces the same thing. But if we are open, if I'm living in Umtata and I'm convinced that there's something special about being there and that there's something unique that we have to offer, then maybe my patterns of consumption, maybe my imagination, maybe what I'm willing to experiment with also needs to be informed by that. So those are the three ideas I'm kind of still stuck on in terms of what I think will get us to a future that looks different and much more exciting 20 years from now.
Do you have any advice for students in these current times? Generally who's perhaps not as motivated as they usually are?
So I love speaking to students. And I think in the current time, and I've got a teenager now, so I have to be careful because, it's always funny when you're talking to students in general, and then now you've got to raise your own. And one gets a lot more careful about what you say. No, I'm kind of joking. I think I have the same advice for my daughter. I think that it's in a way really exciting times. And I'm not talking about the pandemic and the sort of difficult times we're in, but an exciting time in that so much was already changing about the academy, about the possibilities, about what people could do. So we've talked about in the country with all this 4IR talk, how jobs are changing. And I mean, look at Dan. I mean, what kind of job is this? How would we have described this job 20 years ago? And when people ask me now what my job is, I can't even answer in a word because I've gone from where I could answer that my work was research or policy or whatever to, I guess I'm gigging, if that, and maybe that's the best word. So for me, where this speaks to students is that there is no predetermined road anymore. Because of that, and maybe this is now Alice in Wonderland kicking in, any road will get you there. And so I think it's a wonderful time to be less precious about what specific discipline you're in other than the fact that you're learning something from it. Because you'll be able to apply it in so many different spaces. I have an architecture degree. I don't think I've practiced traditional architecture a day in my life. I've used architecture a lot. So I'm not saying, and I guess in that sense I can call myself an architect. But it's to do things that perhaps 50 years ago were not the reason for offering an architectural degree. Planning. Again, I would not call myself a traditional planner. I don't think I've lodged one planning application in my life. But I am a planner and I use planning skills, and I've sat on the Council of Planners because it lends itself to application in so many rich and diverse ways. And so I think my one message would be bold. The attitude and the orientation should be one of learning. I don't think the purpose of education is landing jobs at a place that you can determine now. And so I think there's such a wonderful space for exploration, for adventure. And I think the orientation people need to have is, the usual stuff, hardworking, all of that, all of those old mantras I think still count. But I think learning and this openness to experience and to bringing your whole self into things, and maybe there's definitely a gender message in there as well, because again, this idea that you walk into a classroom and you're there to have somebody teach you something, I think that's old school. I think you've got somebody there who has some experience and knowledge, but the interaction, I think, is where the learning happens. And interaction means that you're bringing something too. And so being your conscious self in that moment, in that learning moment, I think is so important. And so all I would have for young people who are learning today, is, I guess, a message of, be bold, bring your whole self. The purpose of education is learning. And the idea of career is not just transactional. It's really about you being able to bring your whole self into a world that needs so much. And you could bring all sorts of weird and wonderful things to it.